You are listening to Fusion 93 KMSC Sioux City, the student radio voice of Morningside College. It is time for your NASCAR Pit Stop, your source for all things NASCAR to tide you over until race day. We have a complete recap of the first 3 races of the season, plus a preview of Bristol. We'll talk about Ricky Stenhouse Jr., Denny Hamlin, and so much more. And of course, we'll start with Daytona. Jimmie Johnson won the history-making race. We'll talk about all the history that was made a little bit later, but Jimmie Johnson, on his 400th start in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series, won the Daytona 500 for the second time. He started 9th on the board, and this was actually his first race, or first Daytona 500 that he won with crew chief Chad Knaus. Chad Knaus was not his crew chief the first time he won the Daytona 500 back in 2006. Chad was suspended for a very long explanation. Won't go into that. But we do have a soundbite from Jimmy talking about his historical win, his 400th start, all of them with Lowe's as his sponsor. So I think that it says a lot about the relationship between him and his sponsor and Hendrick Motorsports. But here's a soundbite from Jimmie Johnson in his press conference after winning the Daytona 500.
It's just awesome. There's no other way to describe it. 400 starts. Every one of those starts with Lowe's and Hendrick Motorsports.
I forgot about that.
Got a little material left over. To be the first to win the Gen 6 in a Gen 6 car, and that car is a Chevy SS. Just a very, very proud moment. Plate racing, as we all know in here, has been a little tough on the 48 for the last few years. So I'm happy to get through it all, and just a strong race car. I feel like the speed our car had in it allowed me to really have control of the race there late, and I felt like I was sitting on something all day, and was just ready to have some fun when it counted, and it did. I've struck out a lot at these tracks, and left with torn up race cars, and today we had a clean day. I didn't doubt our ability to win. I was just frustrated with circumstances and frustrated with plate racing, and this will buy me a smile for, I'm sure, the rest of the year on the plate tracks.
That was Jimmie Johnson talking about winning his second Daytona 500. Now, plate tracks have not been kind to the 48 team. Johnson has not finished, not counting this Daytona 500, he has not finished better than 25th. And since his win in 2006, he has either crashed out, he had a horrible, horrible speed weeks in 2012, and he even crashed out of the Sprint Unlimited race. So that was a tough start to the season. And he had a yellow, like a bumblebee colored car, a yellow car, for the Sprint Unlimited race. It was kind of sad to see that be retired so early, but he did come back. He raced in the top 10, top 15 most of the day for the Daytona 500, but didn't really lead until the very end. I think the last 80 or so laps is when he finally took over and got up to the front. But he was definitely, as he mentioned, sitting on something throughout the entire race, and it's no secret that he has come out very, very strong this season. We'll talk a little bit more about him when we talk about Phoenix and also Vegas. But Dale Earnhardt Jr., another Hendrick driver, also had a very, very good start to the season. He started 19th in the Daytona 500, ran middle of pack, and then kind of worked his way up front for most of the race. He was sitting towards the bottom of the top 10 when the white flag dropped on the last lap, and finished second. He jumped out of line down to the bottom of the racetrack and just barely missed out on that win. If he would have jumped out a little bit later on that last lap, he may have just taken that win from his teammate Jimmie Johnson. But he definitely had a great, great Daytona 500. And speaking of the Daytona 500, out of the top 10 drivers in that race, 3 of them that finished in the top 10 you really don't hear much of. Regan Smith, Michael McDowell, and J.J. Yaley all finished in the top 10 in the Daytona 500, and each of these drivers is behind the wheel of an underfunded car or part of an underfunded team. The fact that they survived NASCAR Super Bowl and emerged on top is a great testament to both their skills as a driver and their teams. Regan Smith had some interesting moments to close out his season in 2012 after going from the number 78 Furniture Row Racing car last season to the number 51 for Phoenix Racing at the end of the season. Smith basically switched rides with Kurt Busch, and he basically started over. He also had big shoes to fill in Charlotte and at Kansas last season when he filled in for Dale Earnhardt Jr. when he took time off to recover from a concussion. Taking on Daytona for the first time in the number 51, Smith's name was hardly mentioned during the broadcast. Even after starting 40th in the Great American Race, Smith made his way into the top 10 and ultimately finished 7th, one spot ahead of pole sitter Danica Patrick. Another driver who deserves praise after the performance in the Daytona 500 is Michael McDowell. Driving the number 98 for Phil Parsons Racing, McDowell started the Daytona 500 in 38th position. He fought his way up through the field, made it past multiple wrecks, and raced around big names for the 9th place finish that he ended the day with. With sponsorship from Curb Records and the Christian radio station K-Love, McDowell was able to run the entire race. Unfortunately, that may not be a case this season. With sponsorship hard to come by, McDowell and his team are only planning to run the first 5 races in their entirety. It's reasons like this that NASCAR needs to focus their attention on the underfunded teams. If a driver is good enough to battle through the Daytona 500 and come out with a top 10, then he's probably good enough to, have a sponsor. Michael McDowell and the rest of the number 98 Phil Parsons Racing team deserve a little more recognition for their accomplishments in that race. And the final driver who cracked into the top 10 was J.J. Yaley. After starting 41st out of a 43-car field, Yaley fought his way into a 10th place finish. Yaley has been part of many start and park races and often doesn't get to see the checkered flag at the end. For him, not only to finish the race, but to garnish a top 10 finish on top of that is huge for him and his organization that he drives for. I mean, it's understandable why NASCAR focuses on drivers like Jimmy Johnson, Danica Patrick, Brad Keselowski, and others. They're names that everyone recognizes and tunes in each weekend to see, but with NASCAR being a sponsor-driven sport, it's drivers like Yaley, McDowell, and Smith who need to be mentioned as well, especially when they earn that mention. In order to get rid of the start and park teams, which a lot of fans and drivers hope to do, which it should be done. I'm not a fan of the start and park teams, but at least they get out there. But I think they should be able to race. NASCAR needs to give them recognition for great accomplishments. That is well deserved. So congratulations to Regan Smith, Michael McDowell, and J.J. Yaley for finishing in the top 10 of the Daytona 500. Phoenix was the race of Carl Edwards. He won his first race in, I think, 70-some starts. So we finally got to see his signature backflip. I have been waiting for that for a very, very long time. He started 15th, ran a great race, battled quite a few different lead changes, but in the end, he came out victorious. Here is what he had to say about his win.
It is hard to explain. I mean, a lot of people that have been in sports, and definitely Jack and Jimmy understand this, but when you're struggling, it seems like time slows down. You're working harder. You're trying more. You're questioning yourself more. And Kyle Petty earlier, we were being interviewed, and he's like, "Where were you last year? You were gone." I was like, "Man, I was there." That's one of the longest years of my life to work that hard and to not get the victory. So So yeah, I'm very, very happy to be back in the mix here. A victory is huge for so many reasons. To get us last year, we didn't even make the chase. I mean, for me to sit home while everybody was at the chase stuff and at Vegas, that was a little bit of a shock to me. I did not like that at all. And so to get a victory helps us, be in a better position for the chase. It just feels good to win. And I'm just very glad to be here. So yeah.
That was Carl Edwards talking about winning at Phoenix. Now, if you remember back to 2011, he was going for the championship against Tony Stewart. Now, he came in second, but he didn't even make the chase in 2012. He had no wins, and I don't even think he was close to making the chase. So I think that was a big, big blow to his confidence in 2012 and even coming into this year. He knew he had to prove himself, not necessarily for his fans or for NASCAR, but for himself, for his confidence. And he came out and did that at Phoenix, sponsored by Subway. It was the Subway Fresh Fit 500, and it's kind of cool to see Carl Edwards win in his Subway car. Another driver who dominated the week before almost came out with yet another win at Phoenix. Jimmie Johnson finished second in the Subway Fresh Fit 500. He also ran the nationwide race for Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s team, Junior Motorsports, and finished 12th. He ran in the 5 car. So he's had a pretty strong start to 2013, which, after having a rough ending to 2012, it doesn't surprise me that Jimmie Johnson wants to come out strong and go for that 6-pack. He hasn't won a championship since his 5 straight streak broke in 2011. So he is definitely biting at the bit to get back up there in victory lane and up at that head table during awards. Now, in Phoenix, it wasn't just about the drivers, it was about the cars. There were multiple tire problems in Phoenix. A lot of them actually came from Stewart-Haas Racing. Ryan Newman, he drives the number 39, he slapped the wall twice during the Fresh Fit 500. Around lap 100, Newman's Chevy headed straight for the wall in turn 4 when a melted bead sent his car careening up the track. About 40 laps later, he hit it again, but this time it ended his day. And he wasn't the only Stewart-Haas car to be sent to the garage early. Danica Patrick went from a very, very good Daytona 500 to an awful, awful run in Phoenix. She slapped the wall on lap 185. She was coming around turn 4 and blew a right front tire, which sent her car straight into the safer barrier wall and then back down into traffic. Patrick's car hit the outside wall hard enough to dislodge quite a bit of the foam and spread it all over the top of the track. But then her number 10 GoDaddy Chevy hit the wall and it ricocheted down into traffic, colliding with David Reagan. Reagan had nowhere to go and his car pounded Patrick's door right on the driver's side. It littered the track with her neon green sheet metal and all of the foam from inside the door. And this is being considered to be one of the hardest crashes of her stock car career. That it's a close second to Daytona last year when she took that really hard hit on the last lap of the dual race. But this one was pretty bad. She was released from the infield care center without injury. In her comments after the race, she said, quote, "Obviously I blew a right front. There was no real warning. I was a little unexpected. I took a hard hit to the right and then again on the left, but I'm fine now," end quote. Patrick and Newman finished the day 39th and 40th, respectively. So, they weren't the only ones that blew right front tires. All in all, about half a dozen drivers had that problem, but those were by far probably the hardest hits that any of those drivers took. The Las Vegas Motor Speedway hosted the Cobalt Tools 400 this past weekend. Now, starting off the race weekend, I should say, they had a very long practice on Thursday. Stewart-Haas Racing struggled big time in practice. Neither one of their 3 drivers really got above the top 20 in practice. Thankfully, that wasn't the case towards the end. Tony Stewart did finish the race in 11th, but both Danica Patrick and Ryan Newman finished outside the top 30. Rough weekend for Stewart-Haas Racing. Matt Kenseth, though, in just his 3rd start with Joe Gibbs Racing in the 20 car, won the race. It was also his birthday, so that was a great birthday present and a great way to start off this season with a brand new team, brand new crew, brand new car. Come off with a win, the 3rd race of the season, and on your birthday. Hendrick Motorsports also had a very strong showing at Las Vegas Motor Speedway. Casey Kane battled for the win for most of the race. He finished 2nd. Jimmy Johnson had his lowest finish of the season, and it was only 6th. I mean, this is his only the 3rd race of the season, and he hasn't finished lower than 6th. Dale Earnhardt Jr. finished 7th, right behind Johnson. Gordon, on the other hand, struggled quite a bit. He finished 25th and was scored 5 laps down. So Vegas wasn't the best for Gordon. If you remember right, he started 2nd in the Daytona 500. He was also on the front row with Danica Patrick, but struggled a little bit in Vegas. But coming up this next weekend is Bristol. So we get our first taste of short track racing this weekend. I'm pretty excited. I love Bristol. We'll have a preview of that coming up in just a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about one of the Rookie of the Year contenders. Ricky Stenhouse Jr. is already a winner. He has 2 NASCAR Nationwide Series championship wins. He drives for Roush Fenway Racing and recently took over the number 17 Ford in the Sprint Cup Series, and he is dating the most popular woman in racing, Danica Patrick. Stenhouse dominated the Nationwide Series in 2011 and 2012, and he is already taking the Sprint Cup Series by storm. In his first start in the Great American Race, Stenhouse started 28th and finished 12th. Stepping into the car that won the Daytona 500 last season would have been daunting for any average driver, but not Stenhouse Jr. He drove it like he had been there for years, and that didn't change as he took on both Phoenix and Las Vegas. The second race of the season, the Subway Fresh Fit 500, took place at Phoenix International Raceway. Qualifying 12th, he finished 16th. Stenhouse ran a great race. By finishing well in both the Daytona 500 and the Subway Fresh Fit 500, Stenhouse earned him a 9th place point standing, and also is the current leader in the Rookie of the Year battle. Stenhouse ran in the top 5 for a good portion of the day until being shuffled back late in the race. Stenhouse was quite pleased with the number 17 team's performance, saying, quote, "You have to look at the positives and learn from the things that we need to make better. But for the second weekend together, I think we are definitely heading in the right direction." End quote. Stenhouse came out hot again for the Cobalt Tools 400 at Las Vegas Motor Speedway. Although he dropped to 11th in point standings, Stenhouse still ended the weekend with another top 20 finish. He had some ups and downs during the 400 miles. He led his very first lap of his NASCAR Sprint Cup Series career, but he also made some contact with the wall. He dropped off of the lead lap in a late caution, but a late caution in the race did allow him to finish on the lead lap. He said, quote, "We were running in the top 10 no problem, but then we were way too tight for some reason. Every pit stop we made, we got tighter and tighter," end quote. But in the end, Stenhouse and his team ran a very, very good race. And as the Sprint Cup Series heads to Bristol this weekend, Stenhouse has a lot on his plate. He has no starts at this track in the Cup car, but he has 1 pole and 2 top 10 finishes, including a second place last spring in the Nationwide Series. Although the cars are very different, Stenhouse does know this track, and he has a great team behind him. And if he continues to perform well and compete for wins this season, he will be getting a lot more attention for his skills on the track than his skills that captured the girl. On his way to capturing the Rookie of the Year award, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if in a few years the name Ricky Stenhouse Jr. is also followed by the title Sprint Cup Series champion. Up next, I have a lot more information. We'll talk about Denny Hamlin's fine and whether or not he will pay for it. We have Danica's diary. We also talk a little bit about the wreck in Daytona in the Nationwide race. I know that was on a lot of people's minds as the season has gone forward.
That green and orange number 7, Danica Patrick.
And there is the new leader in qualifying, Danica Patrick.
This is going to be awesome!
Just a great performance by Danica Patrick.
Oh, takes her out.
Come on. She's all right after a hard crash.
Boogity, boogity, boogity. Let's go racing, boys, and Danica.
I still have a heck of a lot to learn, and I still am very, very much a rookie.
It was a whirlwind week at Daytona for Danica Patrick. She captured the pole position. She was the first woman to lead a lap under green. She led lap 90 plus 4 more. And she was the 13th driver to lead in both the Indianapolis 500 and the Daytona 500. Now, when she didn't know about that stat until after she had parked the car on pit lane at the end of the Daytona 500, and she had a lot to say about that statistic.
Ever since Dale set out last year, there's been a big focus, after hard crash.
She thought, let's see if I can get this up here. She thought that the statistic was probably one of the coolest ones she'd ever accomplished. Here it is.
But it's a statistic like that personally I felt was the biggest one that from the weekend, to look at the list of names and to fall under them. And while I'm honored to be a first woman to do something, those are great. You can't take those away. A first is always wonderful, but to fall into a historical statistic that is small, that's a small group along with other drivers, and have it not be about being a male or a female, that's something that I aspire to as a driver. I hope that when I am done racing, that people remember me as a great driver, and if they remember me as a great girl driver, that's fine too, but I hope they remember me as a great driver and a list of others. So I feel like that's one of those statistics that's just genderless, and that's pretty neat for me.
She was very, very proud of that statistic, as she should be. She went on to finish 8th in the Daytona 500. She was running 3rd when the white flag flew, but both her and second place runner Denny Hamlin, I believe it was Greg Biffle, got pushed back once Dale Jr. and a bunch of cars behind him went out of line and ultimately got ahead of them. But they both ran a very, very good race. She finished 8th, her first top 10 in her 11 starts in the Sprint Cup Series. There was a statistic released yesterday. She had 971 million impressions on Twitter during the week of the Daytona 500. Now that includes mentions, retweets, replies, everything like that. Last year's pole setter, Carl Edwards, had only 15 million in 2012. So it is no secret that Danica is definitely one of the bright stars of NASCAR, as far as media goes anyway. Phoenix was a kind of a downer for her and her team. She started 40th and crashed out on lap 184 after she blew a right front tire. Talked a little bit about that earlier. David Reagan also hit her as she bounced off the wall. Las Vegas was even worse. She qualified, well, they didn't have qualifying, I should say, because it did get rained out. So she started 36th. She ran towards the back in the 30s actually all of the race. She battled a very, very loose race car. She was quite disappointed with how she went from a great week in Daytona to two very tough weeks in Phoenix and Las Vegas. She ended up finishing 33rd. Both her and her team were quite frustrated with the Las Vegas finish, but she ran very well in Bristol last time she was at the track for the night race last season. She was on the lead lap before getting crashed out towards the end. So I'm excited to see how she will handle the banking at the short track. She also had a bit of a dilemma. She went to the dirt track out there in Vegas with boyfriend Ricky Stenhouse Jr. and took a rock to the head. And I guess it took her to the ground. She wasn't quite worried about a concussion, though she did bring it up after Dale Jr.'s incident last season. But she did end up racing in Vegas. And hopefully she doesn't make any more trips to the dirt track, or at least stays away from the track. Don't want to get hit in the head with a rock. That's not good. Now, the Daytona week had a lot of good things that happened, but there was one wreck in particular that took a big blow to the NASCAR industry. During the COPD 300, 33 fans were injured. 14 were taken to the hospital after Kyle Larson's car went airborne and crashed into the catch fence. His engine and a tire were left in the catch fence, and one of his tires actually went up over the catch fence and into the stands. Tony Stewart won that race, but it was a huge testament to Tony when he was more concerned about the fans than he was about winning. He talked about that instead of his victory when he did take his car to victory lane. Tony actually went to the hospital after the Daytona 500 that Monday and visited a lot of the fans that were still in the hospital from that wreck and couldn't make it to the 500 like they had originally planned. Thankfully, all of the people injured during that wreck survived. Some of them were critically injured, but thankfully no fatalities came out of that. That was a very, very hard wreck to watch. I was watching the COPD 300 with a friend of mine, and both of us were pretty speechless. You knew almost instantly that it was a bad wreck and that people were going to be hurt. Kyle Larson's car, all that was really left of it was the body, the middle of the body, where he sits. It says a huge testament to NASCAR and the safety features they have both at the track and on those cars. Switching gears, Denny Hamlin had quite an interesting week. He was fined by NASCAR $25,000. He made a comment after the Phoenix race, and NASCAR didn't like that. Now, let's see what you guys think. His comment was, quote, "We learned a lot. I don't want to be the pessimist, but it did not race as good as our Generation 5 cars. This is more like what the Generation 5 was at the beginning. The teams hadn't figured out how to get the aero balance right. Right now, you just run single file and you cannot get around the guy in front of you. You would have to place me in 20th place with 30 laps to go, and I would have stayed there. I wouldn't have moved up. It's just one of those things where track position is everything." Now, he was talking about the new Gen 6 cars, and NASCAR was not happy with his comments. NASCAR's response was, quote, "While NASCAR gives its competitors ample leeway in voicing their opinions when it comes to a wide range of aspects about the sport, the sanctioning body will not tolerate publicly made comments by its drivers that degenerates the racing product," end quote. Now, I'm not sure if Denny's comments really degenerated the racing product, but apparently NASCAR thought so. In Phoenix, Denny was fuming mad, and he refused to pay the fine. NASCAR will ultimately take that fine out of his race-winning check at the end of the race, but he does have time to, I guess, voice his opinion about that fine and take it to the NASCAR board. But was NASCAR right to fine Denny about his comments, or is Denny Hamlin right to be upset about the fine? I know I would be. I mean, $25,000 is quite a bit of money, but was NASCAR right to fine him for that comment he made? I guess we'll have to wait and see. NASCAR heads to their first short track of the season this weekend at Bristol. Jimmy Johnson is one of the favorites to win. He hasn't had a finish outside the top 10 this season, so he's definitely on a hot streak. He has 5 top 5 finishes in his last 8 starts at this track, and he last visited Victory Lane in 2010. Kyle Busch is also another favorite. He has been on a run since the end of 2012. He ended the season last year with 6 top 5 finishes in the last 6 races. Pretty impressive if I do say so myself. He was second in the 2008 night race and then won 4 of the next 5 events at Bristol after that. Brad Keselowski is another favorite to win this weekend. He won the night race there in 2011 as well as last spring, and he has had a very, very fast car this season. That is a little preview of Bristol this weekend. Tune in next week for the next edition of NASCAR Pit Stop. Katie Copple is signing off, and I will see you next time.